Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world right now. It's Friday, 5 p.m., and you know what that means. It's time for the Happy Hour Live webcast. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskyCast.com studio, and hope you've had a good week so far. We're going to have some fun over the next hour or so, and we're going to talk a little bit about the future of whiskey in a sustainable world. Not everything we enjoy about the water of life is completely sustainable, and we really need to sort of address that. And I get criticized every time I start talking about this. There are those who will say, we don't want to talk about sustainability. Well, gang, we need to talk about it because it is the elephant in the room. And if farmers can't grow barley because of climate change, or the fields get flooded out all the time, and if we don't have oak trees because we have blights and diseases that are caused by warming weather and changing growing seasons and changing growing patterns, then we are pretty much going to be SOL when it comes to having whiskey 50 to 100 years from now. And we got to preserve this legacy for our kids and our grandkids. So we're going to talk about that over the course of this hour. I want to bring in my guests right now, Susannah Skiver Barton and Shana Farrell. Susannah, of course, wrote for Whiskey Advocate for a long time, now freelancing, and did a great piece for VinePair on the issue of barrel shortages. And Shana just published this really good book. I highly recommend it, A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirits. And welcome to both of you. Shana, I want to start with you real quickly. Let's make the case for sustainability. And I know that's a broad subject, but am I wrong in saying what I did earlier? We have to at least discuss this and start addressing the elephant in the room.
Well, no, Mark, you're not wrong at all. I think that it's a very important topic that we have to be talking about, thinking about. And one of the things I wanted to demonstrate in the book is that there's a spectrum of approaches. So it's not a one size fits all. It's not going to be the same for every category, but the more we start thinking and engaging with these issues, the longer we're going to have whiskey for. So, yeah.
Susannah, let's talk about the barrel shortages. The piece that you wrote for VinePair talks about something that a lot of coopers don't really want to talk about, at least the big boys, right?
Yeah, that's right. I reached out to a number of cooperages, both large and small, and all the big guys either didn't get back to me despite multiple inquiries or politely declined to talk to me. But the smaller cooperages, on the sort of what we call craft cooperages, they were happy to talk and share their experiences, which are pretty similar, that they're getting approached by new clients, new to them, but existing distilleries who are searching out additional barrels because their regular cooperage partners are not able to supply all their needs, at least for this upcoming year.
What is the issue? Is it a shortage of trees? Is it COVID knocking the loggers out of work? Is it a combination of the two?
The sense that I got, it was hard to know because the larger cooperages that are sort of tightening their orders weren't willing to talk to me, but the sense that I got was it was a little combination of maybe some labor shortage, which is true across almost every industry right now. A little bit of the knock-on effects of just prices rising and thus supplies tightening for your normal oak and steel that you need for barrels. And maybe, maybe some other residual COVID factors. I did have more than one distiller speculate that as larger distilleries in Kentucky kind of bring expansions online and start ramping up their production, their barrel orders are much larger, and that's putting pressure on these large established cooperages who obviously, are going to prioritize their biggest customers. So that may be leaving less buffer for the little guys who do not order nearly as many barrels on an annual basis.
That's something that we haven't really thought about or talked about much, is with all these distilleries that are expanding in Kentucky, the impact that has on the cooperages in terms of supplying the extra barrels they're going to need. I mean, Brown-Forman had to build a whole new cooperage down in Alabama just to meet the need for Jack Daniels. because they had been doing everything in Louisville at the Brown-Forman cooperage for Jack Daniels and for their Kentucky distilleries too.
Yeah, and I'm sure that the cooperages are in close conversations with the largest distilleries about what their needs are and projecting out probably many years in advance. But they don't always have the any sense of control over the supply chain up to them. Some do, some don't, and so any hiccup, which we've seen many of in the last 2 years because of the pandemic, that slows down delivery of materials or impedes, hiring enough labor, is going to hit the cooperage and then echo down the line with all their potential customers.
Shana, what are you hearing along this front in the research that you did for your book? What are you hearing about issues with the wood part of things?
That part of the conversation and sustainability I hadn't heard a lot about it. People were really concerned about where their ingredients were coming from, but less so down the line when you're aging things and needing to put things in barrels. So I really looked at that in my last chapter, which is about scale. How do you scale up? I did go to a cooperage and saw how things were working there, and talked to some people who were involved in forest management. And it gets kind of into the weeds with science and resource management, essentially. But there are people who are thinking about, okay, how can we have forest health 100 years down the line? And there are some distilleries who are thinking about sustainability basically because of their bottom line, and they want to make sure that they're around in 100 years. And the barrel part of it is a really big component. So it's interesting to see how how barrels are being introduced in the conversation with the pandemic, with supply chain issues, with the expansion of distilleries, because it all matters down the road. And it's like the thing at the end of the line actually affects all of it.
Well, I forgot to ask the most important question of all. What's in your glasses right now? Susannah, what do you got in yours?
I decided to treat myself on a Friday afternoon to some Yamazaki 12-year-old.
Shana?
I've got some of the Highwire Distilling Company's Jimmy Red Corn, their Revival brand. So yes, got that.
And that's the distillery that you featured in the book. In the whiskey section was what Scott Blackwell and Ann Marshall are doing down in Charleston with their distillery.
Yeah, they were the opening chapter. A lot of their work really inspired my thinking about this and treating alcohol as an agricultural product, because it does come from things that we grow. So I really feel like they were thinking about that in terms of food. And there's more conversations in the culinary world about sustainability than there is in spirits. And people are a little less resistant to it in the culinary world. So I wanted to bring in a distillery who was really thinking holistically about their approach to making an agricultural product.
Well, for the record, in my glass, I have the Bill Phil peated Irish single malt from W.D. O'Connell Whiskey Merchants. Dottie O'Connell, the founder, is going to be on the show this weekend as we head in towards St. Patrick's Day, and we'll explain the origins of the Bill Phil name on the show this weekend. But we have an interesting comment from Tyrone Cote, who says, here's an easy one. Can the tins, so to speak, and excess packaging. And I'm looking at the tin that this came in, and I see the tins that you've got behind you, Susannah, on your shelf. And I'm wondering, and I've got a whole bunch on a lot of the bottles in my back shelf have some tins as well. How much does that add to the sustainability issue with putting all this stuff in tins and boxes? And I mean, some of it helps in terms of getting it shipped safely and not having bottles break, but I really don't think we need all that packaging, do we?
No, it's definitely excessive. I think a lot of the tins are, people don't like it when I say this, but they're part of like the vanity of it. And it's not that excess packaging is actually one of the big issues, whether that's, if it's in a tin or if it's in a case and everything, all the bottles are individually wrapped in plastic and that kind of thing. It's really it's a big deal because recycling is based by municipal, or at least in the US, it's based county by county. So there's no one approach fits all. You can't just take plastic off a bottle and put it in the recycling bin and think it's going to end up in the same place. So, yeah.
And most of what we think we're recycling generally just winds up in the landfill anyway. Recycling is probably one of the most inefficient projects that we have going right now in terms of stuff that doesn't make it to the recycling facilities.
I think it depends on where you are, but I think that's certainly true in some areas, yeah.
Our pal Dave Worthington points out that he's sipping Necnine over in the UK right now, and they had the option to order bottles without extra packaging. Very appropriate. Necnine, I think, won Sustainable Distillery of the Year last year in the Icons of Whiskey Awards from Whiskey Magazine for some of the projects they've been doing. There are a lot of distilleries that are now being built with sustainability in mind. I know that talking with Alistair Day from R&B Distillers, they're getting ready to submit their planning approval for the project they're going to build at Machrihanish in Campbellton. And the state of the art in sustainability has gotten so much better over the last few years than when they built Isle of Rassy 7 or 8 years ago, that they'll be able to run this as almost a carbon neutral distillery. How important is that going to be in terms of getting us to a sustainable future, Shana?
I think it's going to be really important. The more people can wrap that into the blueprints of how they are forming a distillery, the more, you have the systems in place, so you don't have to work backwards. One of the first distilleries to really think through this in a comprehensive way was the Leopold brothers when they were putting together the plans for their distillery. I had the opportunity before COVID to go visit, and just looking at all of the systems that they have is really remarkable. And also thinking about scale, like they knew, okay, we're now in a bigger facility, but this is as much as we're going to be able to do. They have realistic expectations of what's possible for them. But they also don't have to then work retroactively because that's all wrapped in.
Susannah, how long can we expect this barrel shortage to last? Is it something for the foreseeable future that we can expect to see, or is this a short-term thing?
What I heard from everyone was that it's just getting started. And I think that's, based on what we're seeing in other sectors with shortages. And one thing I forgot to mention, but that everyone brought up, was, of course, freight. The cost of freight is so expensive, and that also plays into everything. TBD, but Paul Letko, whom I quoted in my article, he said few spirits is not having a shortage right now, but everybody's talking about it. He said it's coming. It's definitely coming. He can be a little bit Chicken Little at times, and I know he will forgive me for saying that. But I also trust his point of view, and he's pretty tapped into things. So I would say, I don't know, this is probably, if it starts spinning out this year, it's probably not going to be fixed in 2023. And we might, factors I couldn't even begin to predict. But it's not going to be fixed anytime soon. I mean, we just look at bottle shortages, which is another issue I've written about recently. And that continues, has been a problem since the beginning of the pandemic, and it still is 2 years later. And it's probably, again, going to take a long time to resolve itself because there are just so many complex factors at play.
Yeah, when you talk about distilleries that are having to put aside their custom bottle designs because they can't get them made and switching to generic bottles just because of supply chain issues, it tends to hurt the branding part when you have to sort of explain to consumers, well, yeah, we'd love to sell you our whiskey, but we don't have the bottles available right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting, to have just talked about Necnine and the fact that they offered this optional tube with their bottle. I was visiting them a few months ago, and the person I spoke with there, we were talking about how can we make even the bottle a more sustainable package, and one thing they have started to do, I believe, is any locals who have a bottle can come to the distillery and pay for a refill, right? So they don't have to get a new bottle. But Necnine is trying to solve this problem of how can we do this on a broader scale in a way that allows people who are not local to still, get the same whiskey, the same amount of whiskey, but not have to ship a whole brand new bottle to them.
Yeah, because I'm looking at this, and I don't want to use O'Connell's rather as a whipping boy here, but I mean, this is a hefty bottle, and it costs a lot, not only in terms of dollars to ship these things all over the world, but it costs a lot in carbon impact, and shipping bottles around the world is probably not the best way we could be. If we had to start this industry from scratch, it might not be the way we'd be doing things. Is that fair to say, Shana?
I think so. And it's really interesting to look at the effects that prohibition has had on these things because of the way things are regulated in the US. It's state by state. So places like Europe and Asia are actually pretty far ahead of us, where they're allowed to ship alcohol in totes and have not individual bottles, and things can be reused. Where here in the States, we're not really allowed to do that because of the way that things are regulated. So it's very difficult to have a single bottle, go to a distillery and refill it because of the 3-tier system. And then there's often, I think, kind of the excuse for that because of the 3-tier system is they're like, oh, we don't know if it's sterile. We don't know if this is going to be safe health wise, even though, alcohol, there's alcohol in it. So.
And Tyrone has a great question. What role does shopping more locally have in supporting sustainability? Is it necessarily more sustainable to buy from your local craft distiller rather than from that multinational that can get their glass more cheaply and their grain more cheaply, but at a higher cost in terms of carbon for shipping stuff around?
I think it depends what state you're in, again, because of the 3-tier system. So in California, you can't do that. It needs to go from the distillery to the distributor and then back. So if you've got a shop in, let's say, your local distillery and you have a license to sell things, it still has to leave the distillery and come back. So it doesn't, you're supporting them financially, but you're maybe not environmentally. It's a whole mess. Yeah.
Go into that. Go ahead and expound on that a little bit, because that seems counterintuitive to a lot of us. That doesn't make a lot of common sense.
It's completely counterintuitive. I 100% agree. And I can just speak because I live in California. I'm not maybe as familiar with how things work in North Carolina, let's say. But in California, because of the 3-tier system, it's got to go from the producer to a distributor and then to the retailer. So those are the 3 tiers. And it's really difficult to bypass that. In some states, you're allowed to do that. I believe in New York State, there's, in the past several years, a bill that was passed that allows you to sell directly at the distillery. But that was in response to prohibition and making, so it wasn't federally regulated. Now it's state by state. And again, because it's just different in every state. So it's really inefficient. It doesn't make sense to anyone. When you think about supply chain and logistics and freight, it just adds, they're like these invisible costs that keep adding up. And it's not like the sexiest topic, so we often don't really want to think about it or talk about it.
But it's the kind of thing, as I said earlier, that we have to talk about, or we're not going to have a whiskey industry in 50 years from now if we're not careful about this.
That's very true.
Susannah, what else have you been learning that the editors took out of your VinePair piece? What got cut out? Because as we all know, the great Dan Jenkins once said that there's no story ever been written so perfectly that an editor couldn't screw it up. So what did they leave out?
No, I love my editors, and they left my piece quite intact. But I will say, there were a lot of things people told me off the record that didn't make it in, because that's what off the record means. Names were named, speculations were given. I wouldn't really publish something like that anyway. But no, it's as complete a piece as I could write, given the people who are willing to speak with me. It really is like the barrel shortage right now really is a problem affecting small distillers, and not all small distillers, but some. And there didn't seem to be much rhyme or reason to it. There wasn't particularly a pattern. Maybe it's just people who have less long-standing contracts with a cooperage. But No, it stands on its own. Nothing, I didn't leave anything out. No one said anything. There are no secrets that that I can reveal.
Great comment from Tabitha in the UK. Aren't a lot of stills gas fired? Would they have to be converted over to run on green electrical energy? That's a really good question, because a lot of the boilers are natural gas fired boilers, and natural gas is probably one of the least sustainable fuel sources, right?
Yeah, that's true. And I think that there are changes that are happening with that right now. It's just, again, it's sort of, is that in the blueprint of your distillery going forward, or is that something you have to fix retroactively? Because it can be pretty expensive to fix that. So cost can be a barrier there. But yeah.
Susannah, what are you hearing on the U.S. side from the craft distillers that you talked with about how they're trying to build their facilities for sustainability and to try to meet this need?
I haven't heard a lot. I've heard a lot more from the UK and maybe a little from elsewhere about sustainability. It's not as hot a topic in my experience, unless I'm asking about it directly. But I will say I was in Arizona a couple of weeks ago, and I visited Stephen Paul at Whiskey Bellbach, who's a really fascinating guy, great distiller, makes wonderful whiskey. And he said point blank, my distillery is not sustainable. I'm not sure I'll ever have a sustainable distillery. He said he looked into starting the process for B Corp certification because he's interested. He would like to be sustainable. And I guess you do a poll, or you fill out, some kind of questionnaire, and they tell you kind of where you rank from 1 to 100, 0 to 100, and if you have to start at a certain level, like an 85, to even begin sort of the process of being B Corp certified, and they were at like 27 or 36, and he felt very discouraged about it and admitted he does not have a solution right now, and obviously it's not a single solution problem. But I admired that he was willing to talk about it and say, like, this is a real problem for us, and it's largely due to the location that he's in Tucson, which is, and distilling is a very water intensive industry, as we know.
Yeah, he's got a lot of solar energy to run his boilers, but then again, you've got to have the water to put into those boilers. Tabitha points out that a lot of places in Scotland only are gas only, and some even still use coal for firing things. Tyrone Cote says there are a lot of regulations that, if we looked at them from an environmental perspective, would be written a lot differently. What whiskey regulations, if we could start over, what would you change in order to make the industry more sustainable? I'll start with maybe the rule that Scotland has in law that only single malts can only be bottled in Scotland. And then we're shipping all these expensive heavy-duty bottles all over the world. You can ship blends in totes and then bottle them locally. But what regulations could we change that would make things more sustainable?
This is a great question. I love this question. I think this goes back to what we were saying earlier. I think some of the changes around the 3-tier system with those logistics and transportation, that would make a really big difference. But I also think how alcohol is regulated in the United States, not by the TTB, but if you started regulating it maybe through the FDA or another agency, that would make a big difference, because then you could maybe ship things in totes, or you could go, it would eliminate single bottles and that kind of thing. I think that would make a big difference.
If we regulated it through the FDA, they'd never approve it. It'd be treated like tobacco.
And maybe years ago, I don't know, maybe years ago. I think at this point, because these are distilleries are a big part of the economy, that maybe there would be some more flexibility. Yeah.
Maybe the agriculture department.
Maybe, yeah, that would probably be the best solution. Yeah.
Susannah, what's your thought? What regulations would you like to see changed that could make things more sustainable?
Everyone's going to stone me for this, but just eliminate the new charred oak requirement for bourbons and rye. I don't actually think that's a good idea, but since we're talking barrels, that was the first thing that came to mind. It's we go through a lot of barrels, and trees are a sustainable resource if managed thus. But that's still a lot of energy and resources going into millions of new charred oak barrels a year. The Scotch industry would possibly collapse if anything changed with bourbon's aging requirement. But not to mention that bourbon drinkers would rise up en masse and demand a reversion to the real way of making bourbon. No, I don't have an intelligent answer to this question, but I'm going to be thinking about it after this session, because there are probably so many regulations that could be tweaked, and maybe not even in dramatic ways. I mean, I think Shana's example is a great one. Let's work on even changing these prohibition era or repeal era laws that really make the way we package and ship whiskey really environmentally taxing.
Dave Worthington points out, wouldn't distilling procedures need to change if U.S. bourbon and rye stopped using new oak? I don't think they'd have to change that much. It would just, the maturation might take longer.
Well, the whiskey would taste pretty different, but I guess we might see a lot more wood chips and spirals and those sorts of things thrown in. I don't know. This is a troubling thought experiment. I'm sorry I even brought it up. I don't even want to think about bourbon not being aged in new oak.
It is interesting because that's created a secondary market for all those barrels after, where, if they're used to age rum or tequila or something. So I think by necessity there has been that aftermarket that was created, that then those barrels go on to have a huge life.
Yes.
Which makes them sustainable in theory, even though you're shipping them around the world. You're still keeping all that carbon in the wood, because trees absorb carbon from the environment. And if we keep that carbon in the wood and keep it in the form of barrels, then we're not releasing it or using it for other things. Or am I completely off base?
That I don't know too much about. I think with the barrel management, I think that goes back to forest management and resources. And maybe there's some regulations. This is off the top of my head. I really don't know how practical this is or what the implications would be. But for every barrel you have, you have to be thinking. You have to. Or maybe let me start over. Maybe there's some sort of fair trade certification for barrels where you are sourcing the wood from a part of the forest that is sustainably managed or something like that.
Almost like the organic certifications we see.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting idea.
That would be hard to track. I mean, that would be even harder than bottled in bond to track a sustainably produced barrel over 4 to 5 years, and then only bottle the whiskeys in that batch from sustainably produced barrels.
Oh, I don't think so, Mark. I mean, those barcodes on barrels at the large distilleries, they can hold a wealth of information. If Buffalo Trace can set aside, can make strictly kosher certified whiskeys on a large scale, I trust that they or anyone else, right, could keep track of the sustainably sourced barrels. They'd probably put a special stamp on the barrel head, just to be extra sure. I would love to see that, actually, and that would be a huge selling point. And if you'll permit me to ask Shana a question, I'm very curious.
Go right ahead.
Yeah. How much is sustainability a selling point for consumers? I mean, are we seeing spirits brands able to, ask a premium for their product because they're producing? Obviously, sustainability is often more expensive than the conventional ways we're used to. But can they perhaps get bigger margins from implementing sustainable practices and telling their customers about that?
Yeah, I think this is a newer thing that people are just coming to. I think there are people that have always kind of cared about this, but it's a really smaller faction of people. And now, we're experiencing climate change all the time. It's all around us, no matter where we live. And so I think these issues are becoming more top of mind. In terms of the financial aspect, I mean, I think it kind of depends on how old your distillery is. And, you know, if you're able to start with these blueprints, it's easier. But if you have to go back and fix them, you may never be able to like get there with sustainability. Yeah, I mean, I think. Oh, and that affects the cost of things, because a lot of times it's like when you're installing solar panels, let's say, the upfront cost is higher and you actually end up saving money over the long term. And that is a little bit of the case with alcohol as well. And, you know, I think that you can, if you're a distillery that's created a direct relationship with a farm, it's actually a little bit cheaper. It can be, not always, to source that grain. So you could reduce your costs that way. And then I think, you know, let's say you can eliminate single bottles or something, like all of that would make a difference with the bottom line, and you wouldn't have to sell for premium. But I will also say that because for so many years, there was this idea that if it's environmentally friendly or if it's sustainable, it's inherently inferior. And so sometimes I think with those premium costs, it actually helps elevate the status or the reputation. So people are like, oh, people who can afford it are like, let me check this out. This might actually, it's in this price point, it has to be good, right? So, you know, that could work in its favor.
Oh, that's too optimistic. 60 Hertz has a great idea in terms of regulations to be changed. Let's stop making 700 and 750 ml bottles with different labels for different markets. Also, I'm in a different 700 ml market, so let's settle on 750 mLs for all. Yeah, because we're duplicating the effort by making bottles that are in two different sizes.
That problem's going to resolve itself, though, Mark. Now that the U.S. has legalized the 700 ml bottle, within 10 years, everyone's going to be in 700 mils. I have no doubt. I mean, it's already started. You already see certain brands coming out as 700 mils. I think there's a little hesitation from the established brands, but they're all going to get there eventually. And there will be an uproar, and we'll all, forget about it in 2 weeks. So.
And you were worried about the pitchforks and torches crowd, Susannah. Spirit Bomb is going to really set that crowd off, wondering if lab-produced maturation will achieve good results in the future and negate the need for barrels. Bite your tongue, Tabitha. No.
No, listen. I have tried so many of these. I have tried them sincerely, and I have tried them blind alongside conventionally matured whiskeys. And I have been very excited by some of the technologies out there and some of what I think is possible. I still think we're not there yet in most cases. I think the closest that we've gotten was Lost Spirits Distillery, which was, or maybe still is in LA, but is also in Las Vegas. And I credit a lot of that, A, to the technology, and Brian is kind of a mad scientist, and B, like the whiskey he was maturing with that technology was heavily peated, and I think that helped quite a bit. But no, I don't think we're there yet with the lab whiskey. I think it could be a thing, it can be a new thing, it can be a separate thing, but it's not at the point of replicating a familiar, what I would call a classic bourbon or a classic single malt from Speyside or what have you. So.
Well, you just brought up one of my you just brought up one of my sore points, because Brian did all that stuff and didn't tell me what he was doing when he did it, when I interviewed him. And I thought it was good whiskey until I realized, and then didn't only realize several years later that it was lab modified, and he fooled me on it. But I felt a little burned by that, and that's why you haven't seen Brian on the show in a couple of years. Because I don't mind. I don't mind if people do this stuff, but I want him to be transparent about it and just tell me the truth.
Well, his labeling, I think, and I mean, he's pretty open about it at the distillery too. But I don't know. I'll always hold out hope that he brings back the whiskey distilled with seawater and California peat that was a wild ride, and it was a real umami bomb, and just like again, completely separate thing unto itself. But I think the seawater thing, since we're talking about sustainability, presents some interesting possibilities. I'm not saying all whiskey should be going in that direction, but I wouldn't mind seeing a few other distillers kind of play around there, because what he managed to achieve was a very flavorful and frankly very good whiskey.
Love this comment from Pete Head. Only cask strength whiskeys. We don't need to ship all added water around.
It's like the Guinness concentrate that they ship around the world.
Yeah.
Right? They just make a concentrate and then it's made into proper Guinness in the local market. I love that.
I've always had an issue with people shipping water around. Like, what are you doing? That doesn't make a ton of sense to me.
We've had a bunch of folks say that bigger bottles, also 1 liter or 2 liter bottles, would be more efficient than 750s or even smaller bottles. And I'm thinking, let's just do the big Ardbeg More bottles, the great big 4.5 liter party size bottles that they sell outside of the U.S. Oh God, Tabitha, you're about to get banned for this one. Powdered whiskey, just add alcohol.
It was the powdered whiskey got banned. Do you remember a few years ago, alcohol? And this guy invented, it was powdered cocktails. And his pitch was, when you're hiking on the trail and you want a cocktail at the end of the day, just add alcohol. You could have margarita, which did not sound that appetizing to me, but I don't do multi-day trail hikes. But like every state just lost their minds. All the legislators were like, the children are going to take this to school and mix it with their Kool-Aid. And so I don't think alcohol ever got off the ground.
Hey, the little rugrats are sneaking vodka in their water bottles anyway. Why?
Right. Kids who want to drink underage are going to find a way.
They will always find a way.
Well, we're going to let Susannah go because she has an event in New York in, I guess about 20 minutes or so. So, Susannah, thank you for joining us. Once again, highly recommend the article on VinePair.com on the shortage of barrels out there that I heartily recommend you take a look at that one, just because it is an issue that is going to affect us whiskey-wide, because as American whiskeys go, so go the rest of the world, because remember, the rest of the world depends on those barrels over time. So
I just will leave with two thoughts. One is that like the primary way it's probably going to affect whiskey drinkers is just higher prices in the short term. And two, I didn't think of them when you asked me about distilleries talking about sustainability, but I did later on in our conversation. Westland Distillery, I want to give them a shout out for the different facets of sustainability that they are actively working on and exploring. They also are B Corp certified. I believe they just got their certification a couple months ago. Their sister distillery in Scotland, Brooklady, also a B Corp. And you can read a lot about their different sustainability efforts with Dairy Oak and with local grains. But the one I think is most interesting to whiskey geeks like myself is that last year they reformulated their flagship American single malt, and they're phasing out the use of sherry casks because sherry casks have to come all the way from Spain, and that's not the most sustainable way of sourcing maturation casks for whiskey. And I think that's really cool. And the whiskey that they're making tastes really great. They are proof positive that sustainability is not sort of a chintzy selling point and for low quality whiskey. It's great whiskey. They're doing great things. I think they're really leading in that area for American single malt. And I hope, and I'm sure there are other distilleries following them. I'm just like on the spot. I'm having kind of struggling with to think about specific ones I've spoken with. But anyway, thank you, Mark, for having me on the program, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Susannah, and enjoy your event tonight. And thank you for joining us. We'll let Susannah go. And Shana, I want to continue this discussion with you, because it's not just whiskey that we need to look about in terms of sustainability and to look at. When you look at, for instance, things like tequila and mezcal, there are issues in Mexico and with other spirits as well, right?
Yeah. So the way that I approached the book was because, again, it's not one size fits all. And what's going to apply for whiskey is not going to be the same thing for rum or for mezcal or something like that. So each chapter focuses on a different category, and it's just kind of a snapshot. But I mean, in Mexico, there's a lot of boom and bust. There's a lot of monocropping with the agaves. There's a lot of regulation around tequila. I actually focused on mezcal because tequila is a type of mezcal. So I wanted to look at how people are thinking about preserving the environment, but also history and culture through the practice of making mezcal. So that was a fascinating thing. There's a lot of nuance in that story because of politics, because of the way the environment is regulated, the way the boom and bust aspect of it. So I was talking to Pedro Jimenez, who's the proprietor of Mizonte, and he essentially has what he, I don't know that aggregate is the best word, but he is not a producer himself, but he works with producers and he helps them. If you are selling locally here, you can put this in the Mizonte line. So the Mizonte line has a lot of different producers. There's a big focus on the state of Jalisco, but a little bit outside of that as well. And before he starts working with a producer, he has a conversation with them about how they're growing the agave, how they're distilling it, how they're aging it. Also, what's possible in terms of scale, but what are the methods they're using and that kind of thing. So
I want to break away from our discussion for just a second because we literally have breaking news. I just got a news release that hit my email 30 seconds ago from the Stoli Group, directly related to the war in Ukraine right now. Stolichnaya is no more as far as the Stoli Group is concerned. They're going to rebrand and end the use of the Stolichnaya name in direct response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They're going to change the name from here on out and market it only as Stoli. Now, Stoli Group and SPI Group, the parent company that are owned by Yuri Shefler, have been involved in legal disputes with the Russians, with the Putin government for the last 20 years over the rights to the Stolichnaya brand name. And the Russians have been producing their own Stolichnaya brand vodka and claiming that they own the rights to it. And this has been an issue in other countries. But this is just another issue of where companies are trying to distance themselves from Russian heritage and from distance themselves from Russia on that. So I just wanted to share that with you real quickly. Let's talk about vodka. Since we're talking about Stoli for a second, what did you find in the vodka front in terms of sustainability?
So I actually went to the Leopold brothers to talk to them about how they make vodka and gin, because they are sourcing grain within a number of miles from the distillery. They're malting their own barley. They have a malt house, and they're using their neutral grain spirit to then, make their gins, but also to make all of their liqueurs as well. So I was really interested in it from that perspective, because so many distilleries, I mean, as as your audience knows, whiskey takes a while to age. You have to sit on it. You can't just release it. But with vodka and gin, it doesn't require the same amount of aging. So a lot of distilleries will, their heart and soul is in whiskey, but they need to make money. So they'll source neutral grain spirits from a big, I'm totally blanking on the name right now. It's Friday
MGP.
Thank you. Yes. And so they're not actually making their own. And again, thinking about transportation and logistics, but also lack of transparency, where you don't know where any of this is coming from, using commodity crops to grow, to distill and to turn into neutral grain spirits. I was really interested in who's taking a thoughtful approach to vodka and gin and being very intentional about what they're doing. It just so happens that they make whiskey, they make other products, but it's like wrapped into their portfolio that way. But what was really interesting, and when I went to go visit the distillery, I think with some of their building regulations, they have to have a separate little room for their vodka still. The still is much taller, but I think there's some regulations around if it can be on the floor or not. So it's got its own little room that you can see. It's kind of fun.
And we're getting the usual comments about vodka sucks and stuff like that. And yes, it does, but it's probably as some people have asked, probably the most sustainable spirit, just because you can make it from anything. And you can make a lot of it cheaply because it's in a column still.
Yeah, and that's where I think sometimes the issue of using commodity crops comes in. So, and monoculture and things like that. But, vodka's not I'm a whiskey drinker. So vodka is not my favorite, but it is a part of the story. And that's why I wanted to talk to a distillery who makes their own vodka and gin, but also uses it for other things as well. So
what is your next project?
So I'm really interested in water. My background is in water pollution. And so thinking about how we use water in the distilling process, it's one of those things where a lot of people it's very water intensive. We know that, but we really don't have metrics. And I live in California. It's a state environmentally defined by drought and fire. And so it's a pressing issue all the time. So thinking, looking at how distilleries are looking at water, how they're integrating in the process, how they're thinking about it, what the future of that is going to look like for distilleries in terms of water usage. There are places that are flush with water, but there are places that are bone dry. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking about.
All right. I can't wait to see what you come up with on it, because I really enjoyed the book.
Thank you.
I think it's something we need to be talking about, and I'm glad you wrote it.
Thank you. Thank you for reading it.
And thank you for coming on the show tonight. Once again, Shana Farrell is the author of A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirits. If you had to put a pick on there, what is the most sustainable spirit? Would you say it's vodka?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I think it depends, which is basically that when you read the book, it's, it all depends. I think it just depends on the approach, the transparency, where ingredients are being sourced. Yeah. Oh,
this is interesting from our friend in Germany, Malt Mariners. Something locally produced like German Obstler schnapps, which is harvested on private fields close by and made with organic fruits. And he'd put his money on that in terms of sustainability. Yeah. I mean, This whole farm to market and grain to glass craft industry has really sort of improved sustainability for the entire whiskey industry, hasn't it?
I think so. And actually, I think that brandy is a great example of that. Brandy is actually a chapter in the book. It, especially when you look at what they were just saying about it's being, you can grow it on you're growing your fruit on your property, and you can make it right there. I mean, that's really sustainable. But then when you're thinking about scale and places that are using commodity fruit and that kind of thing, or additives or whatever, that then becomes part of the problem. So, but yeah, I think that's a great example of sustainability.
All right. Thank you for joining us, Shana. I really appreciate the time, and thank you for writing the book. Once again, I think this is one of these things that we really do need to talk about if we want to be able to have our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids enjoying whiskey and other spirits when they're adults and of legal drinking age. If we don't start focusing on sustainability now, it's really going to be too late soon.
I agree. And thank you for having me. Thanks for wanting to engage in these topics. I think they're really important. So yeah, cheers to you. Cheers to your listeners. Thanks.
And once again, Shana Farrell is the author of A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirits. That's all for this week's WhiskyCast live show. I appreciate your joining us, and Dottie O'Connell from W.D. O'Connell Whiskey Merchants will be my guest on the show this weekend on the podcast. We'll have that out on Sunday, Monday or so, and then a podcast version of this show will be out midweek next week. Thanks again for joining us. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next week. So long, everyone.